I used to frequent a site called HorrorGamesArchive.com. Don't bother looking for it now. It's long gone. It was a website centered around highlighting horror games, mainly obscure ones, and writing a paragraph-form summary and review of each game. The website was updated every week and never broke formula, so far as my memory serves me. I discovered many of my now favorite horror games on this website: Silent Hill, Hell Night, Clock Tower, Sweet Home, and Sayana Uta. Because of my affinity for horror games and my respect for this website, I had gotten in contact with Dex, the website's creator and main writer, over Skype. Dex and I had spoken for a few months and had developed what I would suppose you could call an internet friendship. He would give me an update every time he made a new review, and I became a co-writer, editing and adding sections to some of his reviews. I even completely wrote his review of White Chamber. He also told me that he was developing his own game, though I'm sad to say I don't think he'd ever finished it. It's no surprise to me that after about 11 months of our frequent conversations, he asked me of all people to write a review while he was away for spring break. He sent me the link over Skype of that week's game, Mortis. He told me it was a PC game that came out in 2001, and that the copy he had sent me was completely legitimate. I had never heard of this game in all of my years, and on the vast internet, but whenever I asked him where he had found the game, I never received any response. I clicked the button to download the game, which took about 5 minutes because Dex thought it right to send me the game over Skype. He was nice, but he wasn't all that bright. I looked inside the zip file Dex had placed the game into and saw just an executable file and a README file. I took the file's request and read it to find what is typical for the game's README file: original game credits, other credits, and installation instructions. None of this interested me, but what did interest me was the controls. Using my master investigative skills, I inferred that Mortis was a Resident Evil type game. What with the up to move forward, left and right to turn, and space while in action mode to attack, I got myself ready for clunky controls, hilariously bad voice acting, and cheap scares. I should have been ready for much more than that, though. Before even playing, I researched the game and found absolutely nothing about it. No mention on any forums, nothing. I even googled Nemesis Games, the company responsible for the production, and found absolutely nothing on the subject. Clicking the executable file immediately launched the game. This was actually quite the surprise, to see a game meant to run on Windows 98. Or the ilk instantly boot up on a Windows 7 computer of last year was, well, pretty stunning. But regardless, the game launched. I saw the familiar names of Nemesis Games show up at the bottom of the screen, along with the traditional copyright and notifications below them. The Nemesis Games logo was very low budget looking, almost like someone threw it together in Photoshop. However, I suppose an obscure game nobody's ever even talked about before shouldn't really have the highest of hopes. I was going to capture a screenshot, but the game crashed every time I pushed the print screen button. What I did manage to capture, however, was the title screen, if you can even call it that. All it consists of is a crudely drawn rendition of what I think is the main protagonist with a gun to his head, with the text under it and a scratched up text reading, "Appuyez sur," and the escape key. Following the only instruction I could understand, I pressed the escape key, a decision I regret wholeheartedly, by the way. Upon my input, the gun fired into the character's head. The character then cracked a smile, one of relief and assurance. This was a gruesome scene, certainly, and it's a surprise that the game never got any negative attention, especially in a time when violence in video games was, in all honesty, a pretty big issue. The opening cutscene then loaded, and I was given an FMV cutscene with very high production values, given what I had already seen. It was live action, but the video had very high contrast and a color scheme consisting of dark, saturated shades of orange and green. The first shot was that of an actor playing the main protagonist, a man anywhere from the age of 17 to 20, in an orange hoodie and a black, sleeveless coat over top of it. His head were in his hands, which were shaking furiously. The camera then panned down to a gun on the table he was sitting in front of. The next shot was that of the protagonist's left eye peeking through his fingers, only for his arm to jolt down, grab the gun, and shoot himself in the head. He fell back out of his chair, and his arms and legs twitched disturbingly. I didn't know what to think. This was not only a graphic, realistic representation of death, it offended me as someone who had closely known people who took their lives at a young age. How could this be in a game? all of my years of gaming, never once have I even seen such a realistic, gut-wrenching scene, especially not one of such a controversial subject matter. The scene faded to a loading screen featuring the main protagonist's twitching hand. While it was loading, the voice of the main character sounded in my headphones. Though it sounded as if he was speaking underwater, he spoke in French, and with my limited knowledge of the language, I am fairly certain he said, "Je m'appelle Patrick," meaning "my name is Patrick." There was, however, no sense of urgency in his words. He spoke them slowly and calmly in a serene tone. And he didn't merely speak them. It felt as though he was talking specifically to me. In a few dozen seconds, it took after that to load the first level. I had some time to think about it. Why would the main character of the video game address its player and tell them such information? When the first level finally loaded after what felt like an eternity, the main character, Patrick, awoke in his hoodie, ripped overcoat, and jeans from the opening cutscene. He stood up from his bed, and this is where I gained full control. My suspicions weren't confirmed in that it did control like Resident Evil, but it controlled a lot better. It's hard to explain, but Patrick had more weight to him, and I was able to get through doorways without having to run against the wall all the goddamn time. The second major difference was that the camera angles were not fixed, but instead swung around freely in the same style as Silent Hill. Other maneuvers were sidestepping, backstepping, jumping in the 4 cardinal directions, as well as vertically crouching and crawling. After practicing Patrick's acrobatics routine, I searched his room for items that may be useful in later puzzles, something Silent Hill and Resident Evil have taught me well. I found nothing but a generic handgun in the dresser and a bottle of prescription medication, which description read, "Do not use under any circumstance." I didn't, of course. It was when I had finished searching frantically for plot-important objects where I could truly see what was actually happening. I heard a scratching coming from all around the room. It was in both ears. And although it was subtle, it was the only sound I had heard yet. Though the noise was quiet, it was so frequent that my head started to throb. I shot my hand out to turn down the volume and a wave of relief swept through my body. I pressed on but was only met with another roadblock. The door out of the room was unable to be opened. Patrick did not even attempt to open it. He merely stated in a now shaky, stuttering voice, "Je ne peux pas échapper." The subtitles did not state an English translation, but I wrote it down in my notes. At this point, I didn't want to know what it says. As I walked around the room searching for a point of escape, Patrick would start to say things like "je dois" or "allez, venez." Patrick was growing frantic. He started to walk more slowly or quickly at seemingly random intervals. After a while, he started to simply shamble off his own volition to random areas of his bedroom. There was a window in his bathroom adjacent to his bedroom. The game gave a button prompt. Regarder space. Upon pushing on the space key, the game changed to a first-person viewpoint. Patrick was on the second floor. I tried opening the window, but to no avail. "Je n'ai pas échapper," Patrick stated again. There were no doors, no way out. There was one more option, though. I opened my inventory, highlighted the medication, and selected its use option. Sure enough, Patrick shakily opened the bottle and popped the medication into his mouth. For a moment, all remained normal until after a few seconds, he began to slow to a crawl and eventually collapsed on the ground. "Je suis en vie." Patrick spoke those words in the subsequent loading screen, but instead of calmly, he spoke in this very dull, monotone manner that was broken up into multiple utterances separated by harsh voice cracks. The loading screen was that of Patrick's foot, twitching, as if Patrick had still just died. It was at this point in which I questioned the continuity of these events. I clearly saw Patrick shoot himself and fall to the ground dead, but I was controlling an alive Patrick only to cut back to him dead once again. Patrick ends up in this alleyway. He was lying on the ground and the camera was swinging around frantically and elastically. It was hard to gain my focus, and this effect did not cease even when I gained control of Patrick. The same prompt existed as when I was in the bathroom. Regarder space. When I chose to obey this command once again, the game shifted to first person as before, though it was looking up at the second floor window. As I pressed the arrow keys to move, Patrick did not walk, but rather shambled like a dead man walking. Every other step or so he would wince with pain, but with a different, increasing sound of agony as I went on. I almost wanted to get through this section of the game as quickly as possible, for his sake. But he's just a game character, right? As I proceeded, the moans of torment started to echo in my headphones. I almost wanted to unplug them and play the sound through the speakers, but my partner was asleep in the other room and I really didn't want to wake them up with this of all things. The echoing started to give me a massive headache, so I turned the sound down to a lower, more hushed volume. As I was focusing on the sound, I lost track of where I was going. I tried to get my bearings, but I came to the conclusion that I wasn't going anywhere. Every corner I turned just led me to another adjacent alley. As I turned each corner, Patrick gained new behavior. He started looking behind him, trying to search for someone who might have been following. I took to his attempts to find someone and turned him around myself, to find nobody there. Turning around let Patrick shake and peek behind him less, almost seeming reassured. I can't get it out of my head that I swear he said thank you in English when I did this. At the time, I thought it was only in my head. I began growing bored of all this walking and turning around until I noticed something. The scratching noise had began to continue once more. At first it was quiet and I barely noticed it, but it began to get incredibly grating despite my volume being set to almost mute. Patrick began picking up his walking speed, even with his condition. He began yelling out in agony, and there was a harsh cracking sound with each step he took. Along with the horrifying sound of broken bones grinding against each other was a quickly loudening scratching sound. The scratching then turned gradually into a scraping, then to a grinding, and finally to a screeching. The camera then swung around to face Patrick, and it was then when I saw him. No, it was not that of a human. It was chasing me relentlessly. And I was amazed that I have no idea how I didn't notice it before. It was a creature that resembled a human, but was not a being of flesh and blood. Rather, it was a being of bone. Its jagged edges jutted out in every conceivable direction, scratching the stone floor and the brick walls that only seemed more constricting as it grew nearer. It did not run and certainly did not walk. It simply moved. I can't explain the manner in which it achieved motion or why, but it merely proceeded in its direction. It was at this point where the turn stopped, and I was running down an endless, isolating hallway. It was then when the most disturbing, haunting thing had occurred. Patrick had pleaded for help. It wasn't in French, and there weren't no subtitles. It was in English, and it had a sense of fear that I'd never heard or never again will hear. For as long as I live, I'll never forget the words, "Help me, please. You can't let me die. I don't want to disappear, please." And this wasn't a scripted event. There was no way this could have been. There was no way that this was a game. What sick, twisted individual would make this? Was this a cry for help? Was this somebody's last words to the world? Was I playing out somebody's pleas for help? It approached me. That thing was growing nearer by the second as Patrick was only growing more desperate, speaking shakily as if crying. "Please, don't let him get me. I don't want to fade away. Please." It was only after the last word in that the most shocking thing I had ever witnessed occurred. It finally caught up and grabbed Patrick with a stray bone. Osseous shards began protruding out of what could barely be called its body as it hunched over Patrick, who was now squirming on the ground. His screams pierced my ears, and I felt like screaming too. His arms and legs twitched frantically, and I could not tell any more whether he was either alive or he was dead. I know I must sound weak, but I was horrified. Between this, the screams for help, and the theme of the game, my body could barely handle the stress and anxiety. The screen cut to black as I heard the sounds of scraping and gnawing on top of a barely audible, "I am so very sorry." But it was not Patrick. The game closed and cut back to my desktop with nothing but the zip file open. Something was different, however. The executable was gone, nowhere to be seen. I checked many folders until I rediscovered it in my recycling bin. I tried opening again, but all that happened was a black screen with deafeningly loud scraping noises playing until I forcibly closed the game via the task manager. I tried permanently deleting this wretched file there, but for whatever reason it refused. It even opened a few times with my effort. Again, playing those disgusting sounds. I at last admitted defeat and checked the zip folder once more and checked the README file. To see it had been altered to contain only one sentence. "I am so very sorry to leave you all like this. Dex." It was a fucking message from Dex. A few days later, the website was taken down and I never heard from Dex again. I cry about it to this day. Almost 2 years since the incident, I still hear his voice. The last thing he ever said to me was, "I am so very sorry." I'm sorry too. I'm really sorry that I couldn't help you. And with this, I bid you one last farewell, my dear friend of mine. Goodbye, Dex. Alright, so we end this creepypasta with what is simply a very elaborate suicide note. Now, of course, when I was reading it, I sort of read ahead as I read these stories, and the first time when I noticed the suicide and whatnot happened at the end, or the suicide note authorship being given, you know, the whole goodbye Dex, I almost shit myself for a second because I thought, was this going to end with somebody who killed themselves? Because usually it's, suicide is one of those things that really hits me as a very off-putting thing in creepypasta. Sometimes it can be done, and it can be done very well, but there has to be a believable factor to why somebody would kill themselves, right, after playing what is simply a video game. You know, is it something in the video game that traumatizes them so heavily that now they can't live with themselves, or, you know, some revelation given where, you know, simply continuing to live is not a possibility for these people. And usually when it comes to a video game with something that detached and with where the stakes aren't so high, it's just something that comes off as incredibly tasteless and just throws you off entirely. So over here, it was good that it wasn't this person doing it, and it was actually the site owner, which was rather interesting to actually get a suicide message from the person. Not only is the game very well handled, of course, the description of it, the imagery, and the build-up was done absolutely wonderfully, I gotta say. You know, reading through this entirely and then, you know, having the ability to perceive whatever was happening, you know, down to visualizing the character, even visualizing the environment. I mean, honestly, I was thinking of this game as just your standard PS1 horror game, and honestly, in that respect, I would actually like to see this as a real thing. Even going as far as to read the ending of this game and seeing how it would treat the player's computer, you know, starting up to scratching noises. We've actually seen those same phenomenons in many of our EXE game playthroughs or obscure video game playthroughs, like in the horror category. So it's actually really nice that they do touch upon that, and it does give it an even heightened sense of believability, because of course, to me personally, I've seen tons of games do that, and to be given sort of that connection is a big deal to me. And as far as I can say from the game perspective, it's done very well. Now, as a story, I have to say that it has its vague parts to it, which does make it eerie. I mean, why would Dex ultimately create this suicide note? I mean, there's got to be something this person's going through, and something that they never let anybody into. But except this player, where they passed them this game to review, but eventually it was all just a suicide note. I mean, all you can really gather from this is that maybe Dex was being hunted down by someone, or potentially something, and maybe the guilt was just too intense and they either killed themselves, or it was actually just a very clever dead man switch, or some way for them to get the message out. Whatever it was definitely intense, and it was definitely very, very weird, but that's ultimately the best part about a creepypasta, you know, is when you sort of have to put those pieces in your head together, because ultimately to me that's what makes it a very good story at the end of the day, is when you're actively piecing these stories in your mind. But other than that, I gotta say, from that perspective, it's while it is a good story, it definitely is a good story. You know, there's no doubting about that. It is a little off-putting because, again, just because you have the suicide tossed in, I wish a little bit more got explained. But hey, again, like I said, one of the best parts about these is just how open-ended they can be, just how vague they can be sometimes, so let the eeriness build up. So at the end of the day, I'm glad that I got a good story, and ultimately the game that was depicted in this was handled very well too. So all in all, I gotta say this was a very, very interesting creepypasta. I did like Mortis. It was definitely bringing me back to the old school creepypastas, and it was nice to see that they touched upon a unique game and gave it some technical believability jabbed in from other games such as Resident Evil and Silent Hill to help you visualize it better. Ultimately though, I think Mortis is a good creepypasta, but as always, I do like to ask what you like to think about this creepypasta in the comment section below. What would you rate it and what would you change to make it better? This has been another episode of Haunted Gaming, part of Creepypastas. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. This is me, Mutahar, and wait, before I end, I gotta address the big elephant in the room. I know my pronunciation of the French language wasn't exactly perfect, You know, in Canada, you're sort of expected to read here and there, and yeah, I can read, I can write a bit, I can even speak it a bit here and there. You know, being a Canadian myself, it's one of those things you pick up. But I do want to apologize to somebody who was from France, and I totally butchered your language, did not mean to. And hell, that goes for any other language I butcher, especially on the deep web videos. That being said, I am out.